Devastating floods caused by torrential rains have wreaked havoc in Kwazulu-Natal this week. Hundreds of people have been killed by the floods and mudslides. Humanitarian efforts are currently underway to assist communities affected by the flooding. On Wednesday, President Cyril Ramaphosa visited the province to assess the damage and to see for himself the unimaginable scale of destruction.
The bridges have collapsed, the roads have collapsed, people have died, people are injured. So this is a catastrophe of enormous proportions.
This week on The Story, we'll speak to News 24 journalists who have been on the ground in KZN, bringing you the latest on this disaster. We're now joined by Kayleen Morgan, multimedia journalist for News 24, who is in KwaZulu-Natal. Kayleen, tell us about your experience on the ground and filming the devastation.
It's been quite devastating. I think it's a little bit difficult to put it into words in a way that people would be able to adequately understand just how terrible it's been seeing this firsthand. I think, when you watch it on television or so forth, it doesn't quite hit you as hard as when you're seeing, people's homes literally fall through the ground, fall into, pathways that have now become rivers. And I think particularly the first day when I started covering these floods, which was on Tuesday morning, we found ourselves in an area, Kwandingezi. We were just driving around, trying to assess some of the damage. And by virtue of just moving around, we stumbled across an old man who had just lost his 6-year-old son, who he'd carried about 10 kilometers away from the low-lying area where they live. And he'd left his wife and his other young child behind with injuries after their house collapsed. And I mean, throughout that day, this is really what we were seeing. The emergency services, these are informal settlements, and it's also low-lying areas, so it's at the bottom of mountains. You can imagine emergency services can't get into these areas by car. And I think it's even more difficult by foot because the soil is so soft. There's a lot of mud. So a lot of people were advised that if there are injuries or if there are deaths, people would have to find a way to carry their loved ones up to the main road where emergency services would be able to help them. But even then, emergency services were stretched. The havoc that this has caused has left hundreds of people displaced, but also a lot of injuries, a lot of missing people. Some of the people that we spoke to said, we're carrying our loved ones up to the main road, but there are still several people down there who we can't find. They're under the rubble, and we also don't have capacity to dig them out. I mean, we can't really use our bare hands. We're also scared of losing our lives in that instance. So you're driving and you're just seeing bodies on the side of the main road. Loved ones don't even have the time to deal with this trauma or be visibly distraught. They're just thinking, how are we going to pick up from this?
Absolutely heartbreaking. What about the president and his assessment of the damage on Wednesday?
The president was moving between various areas in the eThekwini municipality because that was said to have been hit the hardest. This was on Wednesday, and eventually I think the president himself was able to see that there is a necessary push for the province to be declared under the state of disaster. Him speaking to the finance minister to access funding to assist the people of KwaZulu-Natal who've been affected by this. I think it was also eye-opening for him to see just how many people had been displaced, but at the same time how difficult it must be for emergency services to work this way and therefore need that extra financial boost to be able to assist people. We're seeing a lot of community members club together just to assist one another in every way that they can possible. But I think the president being on the ground here was enough for him to just pick up on how dire the situation is here in KZN.
Kayleen, residents have been dealing with power outages, water shortages, the collapsing of roads and landslides. Can you tell us how the people living there are coping with the situation? You said it seems like people are in shock, really, at this point. What was your experience of people that you spoke to?
I think personally for me, as a journalist who does not work in, the coastal area of KwaZulu-Natal, this was new to me. But for a lot of the residents here, it seemed almost as though this is, something that they've grown accustomed to. I don't think perhaps on the scale where we're seeing so many people losing their lives, but it was definitely a case of we've been here before. This is not new to us. It happens every now and again where we are losing our homes, we are unable to get to work, we're losing our loved ones. That's the sort of sentiment. And so a lot of people are just moving really quickly to kind of rebuild their lives and try and get on with it if possible. But also because the rains are expected to continue, I think a lot of people are just really trying to rebuild before the rains begin again and make sure they're safe and they've got somewhere to sleep. But I think it's been difficult being on the ground for me personally because things are moving so fast. There's just so much havoc throughout the province. It doesn't matter where you're driving, whether you're in the suburbs or whether you are in the rural areas. You can see it even when you're just on the main roads like the N3, how the landslides have impacted, the way that the landscape of KwaZulu-Natal looks at the moment. So I think, at some point emotions sit with you when you get home, or for me specifically, when you're in these rural areas and you yourself start to feel the impact. And I mean, Wednesday was a real eye-opener for me because as we were leaving the area just outside Claremont where the president had been, one of the main roads caved in and we were still there. And we struggled quite a bit to get out of the area. Several main roads, you make a U-turn, the GPS is redirecting, you get to a new main road, it's caved in. You're basically driving on a piece of the road, trying to get to the other side. And I think that fear really jumped in for me, that reality that any moment now, this very road that I'm driving on could also cave in and I could lose my life anytime now. So I think, you leave the journalism hat at some point and you become human again and realize that anytime now, that could be me too.
Kayleen, can you tell us about some of the humanitarian efforts underway?
We've seen Gift of the Givers, as well as the Red Cross community on the ground, offering disaster relief, basic needs, just things like blankets, tin food, as well as the municipalities coming out just to take a record in terms of damages, people who have lost their homes, people who have been injured. So there seems to be a lot of people moving into community halls, into schools that are still standing in these areas, and that's where we're seeing particularly these two nonprofit organizations coming to aid. But there also seems to be a great sentiment in the country where people are trying to establish funding backer buddies where they can donate to people who are here. I know I've received a lot of messages, a lot of social media messages asking if they could send me money, and because I'm on the ground I could possibly just pass whatever I can over to the people that we interact with. So I do think there's a great sentiment in the country at the moment for people wanting to come together to assist the people of KZN, or at least to support some of these nonprofit organizations that are on the ground.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Kayleen, and please stay safe out there, bringing us those stories, those human stories from the ground, a terrifying and devastating situation. We're joined now by News 24 senior political reporter, Junior Khumalo. Junior, what areas have been worst affected?
So the most affected areas are during the floods were the Pinetown area, which is just west of Durban as you are heading on the N3 as you are heading towards Pietermaritzburg. So that was one of the most affected areas during the floods. Also, the Ntuzuma area is another heavily affected area, and some parts of the south of the province have also been severely affected by the floods.
Junior, can you describe the scenes of devastation? What did you see?
From a humanitarian standpoint, it was carnage. It was a desperate situation for a lot of people. Most of the people that live in Pinetown, if you are familiar with the terrain, they live on the faces of like mountains. So most of the places are like informal settlements. And those that live on the faces of the mountains were affected mainly by landslides. So a lot of houses were completely covered by landslides, and a lot of people lost their lives there. A lot of people are still missing. And then in terms of the people that stay in the lower lying areas, they were affected by flooding. So there were a lot of floods that went into their properties. So a lot of properties was demolished. A lot of roads were damaged. Bridges were swept away. I think the last type of flood that was almost at this level was the 2017 flood. But this, from just seeing it on the ground, it looks like it was way worse.
Junior, there have also been a lot of reports, as you mentioned, about infrastructure collapsing. Is that a result of a lack of maintenance or the state of the stormwater infrastructure? Have authorities commented on that?
So a lot of the damage, first, I think, is as a result of people building in settlement that is not suitable for human settlement, actually. So most of the buildings are in land on the sides of mountains or on low-lying areas that is definitely not suitable for housing. So that is what the local government has been complaining about, that this land has not been allocated for housing, but because people are desperate to find shelter, they have made their homes in such areas. But also, yes, the provincial government has to take fault because the drainage system in the province has been fingered in most of the floods that have happened. I think last year, 2021, in December, there was a lot of flooding that also happened, and the provincial government did acknowledge that the drainage systems have not been taken care of. That's why there's a lot of flooding that is happening. But also, I saw a lot of researchers, a lot of academics have also been blaming this on climate change as well. So there's a lot of factors that have resulted in the flooding itself and also the damage that has happened to most of these places.
And Junior, how long is the bad weather expected to last?
There is a view that it's going to last until after the Easter weekend. So it's going to rain across the whole weekend during Easter. And that's what a lot of people were disappointed by, because a lot of the Durban economy is centered around tourism. So a lot of people were expecting that a lot of tourists are going to come. This is, I think, one of the biggest holidays to come after the state of disaster. The national state of disaster was called off. So a lot of companies in Durban were expecting that people are going to come in, tourists are going to come in and revive the economy. But as a result of this flooding and the damage that has happened, a lot of people are going to be tentative and not want to go to Durban. So yes, the rain is going to be across the Easter weekend.
And Junior, rescue operations, they've been hampered by the weather. What is the death toll so far?
So rescue operations have been severely hampered by the weather conditions. As I had already indicated earlier, that the Kwazulu-Natal area in Pinetown was one of the most heavily affected areas. And when we got there on Wednesday, the emergency services couldn't even access the areas. So we also had to drive on roads that had caved in. We had to just risk it and get to that area. And when we got there, like, a lot of people, I think at the police station that we got to, there were over 20 people that had lost their lives. And at the time, the death toll the official death toll was 45. And people in the area were already telling us that that was significantly under the number that was expected to be announced the next day. So right now, as you stand, I think the death toll is at 306, but it's expected to rise as a lot of missing people are being found, and most of them are being found deceased, unfortunately. So yeah, that's been another situation on the ground. But the provincial police commissioner had indicated that they are expecting to receive a lot of assistance from other provinces. So a lot of policemen, a lot of firefighters from neighboring provinces, Mpumalanga, Gauteng, are going to be coming into KZN and assisting with the rescue operations. So hopefully that will also speed up the process of trying to rescue those who are still trapped and also finding the missing individuals.
As a journalist, Junior, I'm sure you've covered catastrophes before, but how does this compare in your experience as a journalist?
I have covered quite a few catastrophes, but being a political journalist, you don't see the amount of carnage that we saw over this week. It was just unbearable, especially Kwazulu-Natal. People had to literally carry the dead bodies of their loved ones to the main road because the emergency services couldn't access the area. So they had to literally carry their own deceased to the sides of the main road and just lay them there on the ground and wait for hours for emergency services to come. So it's just unreal to drive past roads which are littered with bodies, like literally littered with bodies. And you are following a police car that is picking these bodies up, putting them in the back of the van. We wrote a story about a man who refused to leave the side of his deceased child. So as the police were picking up the bodies and putting them in the back of the van, he was sitting with all these bodies. And he kept looking at the child, kept opening the white sheet that had covered the child as if to make sure that he was comfortable. It was just unbelievable. It was... I think you just, as a journalist, you tend to switch off your emotions and you are on autopilot the whole time. You try not to think about it because these are human beings at the end of the day. And they are asking you for assistance. There's not much you can do. You're on the ground just to report on what's happening. So it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking.
Well, Junior, thank you so much for keeping our readers and listeners up to date on this devastating story. That was Junior Kamalo, senior political journalist for News 24. That's all we have time for this week on The Story. Join us again next week. I'm Catherine Rice, and this week's episode was recorded by Amy Gibbings.